I'm Dan Wagner. I'll be your speaker this evening. Pleased to have you all here. I'd like to begin with a quote that you probably remember very well. Actually, I remember it very well because it's been my life for the last 20 years or so. A quote from Fyodor Dostoevsky, who said, "Try to pose for yourself this task, not to think of a polar bear, and you'll see that the cursed thing will come to mind every minute." I read this in college, and it impressed me a lot because I tried it, and I had some trouble. Let's just see how you do. Would you just bear with me for a second? Okay? I'm going to ask you to not think of a white bear, and just go for it. I'll time you. I'll give you 30 seconds, and we'll see how you do. Okay? Go. Okay, stop. How many people succeeded in not thinking about a white bear for the 30 seconds? Not once, the whole time. Hands, please. 1, 2. Anybody over here? 2. Okay. What did you do? What did you try while you were sitting there? Well, did you just try not thinking about it? No, you probably tried to think of something else. A number of people I could see in the front here closed your eyes. Big mistake. Okay. You want to keep them wide open. Be thinking about anything other than a white bear. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for some replacement thought. So you rummage through your mind. You rummage through the things you've done today. You look around the room. You look at me. I'm no help. And you try to find some other thought, something other than a white bear that you can dwell on for a little while. But it seems to be a very, very difficult task. And in fact, the only time I've ever been in a group of people where there were a significant proportion of the population could do this, I gave a talk once to an anorexia bulimia self-help unit. And all these thin arms came up. Okay, so there are some people who have the ability to stop thoughts. I'm not sure if that's a good thing. Among those of us who are obsessed by things we try not to think about, maybe that's okay. But now, that little challenge that I read about Dostoevsky a long time ago, I thought, let's see about other people. Let's try making it an experiment. So in about 1985, I did a little study where we sat people down in a room and asked them to try not to think about a white bear. They talked into a tape recorder as they were doing this, and we also asked them to ring a bell on a table in front of them in case they happened to have the thought. So they were reporting it and ringing a bell. So we tell them, as you say your thoughts aloud, please try not to think of a white bear, but mention it or ring the bell if you do. And I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but I mean, there's really no comparison group in this experiment. There's no control group. It's one bar. And I just find it startling that, on average, people ring it once per minute. That's exactly what Dostoevsky said. It tends to come back about 1 time per minute. And well, I know that's not a very good result. In fact, I never have published this particular graph. But I did publish a different graph based on this experiment in which a second part of the experiment was also included. So in addition to asking people to try not to think about a white bear, we also had these folks try to think about it for a while and ring the bell in case they did. This is what happens to a group of people who are ringing the bell over the course of 5 minutes, and they're intentionally thinking about a white bear. The people with the blue line are doing this just before they try suppressing it. The people with the gold line are doing it after suppression. So if you've just suppressed the thought and now you come back and you're told, please think about it, what happens is you think about it pretty much constantly. So it's not only that you can't get rid of the thought when you're trying not to think about it, that first blue bar, but later when you allow yourself to think about it, you become obsessed. We get this rebound effect. That reminded me of a whole lot of things that happened in my life, that happen in people's lives generally, and I thought this is something I want to spend some time on. So I've spent the next 20-some years thinking about this and running experiments to see what the implications were. Well, what that's done is it's led me to a lot of studies that have opened up what I think is a kind of a scientific study of thought suppression. What are the conditions under which we do it? How well does it work? How poorly does it work? All those kinds of things. And what I'd like to talk to you about first this evening is this scientific study of thought suppression. Now, I'm not the inventor of this. I think actually Freud isn't either, but he's a good culprit for talking about the interesting effects that you get when you try not to think about something. He said in the analysis of the examples of the counter will, which is the term he used for it, we can regularly recognize a process that opposes an intention without putting an end to it. So you may try to do something, and there's some part of your mind that does the opposite. The same way as when you're trying to suppress a thought, there's a part of your mind that seems to will against that and produces it. Well, William James found something very similar. Described it as an observation of his. The strongest tendencies to automatic activity in the nerves often run most counter to the selective pressure of consciousness. Both of them seem to recognize this kind of rebound, this boomerang in the mind in their own ways. Well, their ideas and lots of other work have led me to propose something I've been calling an ironic process theory. This theory was published in '94, and since then, a lot of work has gone on it. Let me just describe the theory to you, because basically the theory is a mechanism of sorts that is designed to produce the rebound effect and other similar kinds of effects. It sort of predicts that there are thoughts that when we try to suppress them, they're going to come back. This ironic process theory says there are kind of two processes that come to bear whenever we try to control our minds in any way. One process I call an intentional operating process. This searches for mental contents to create the desired mental state. It's effortful, conscious, and interruptible. So when you were trying not to think about a white bear, this was your conscious search for distractors. You were trying to think of anything other than a white bear, and in doing that, you were consciously looking around the room. It took effort. When I told you to stop, you were able to interrupt it. Nobody's still doing this. It has the processes of a standard kind of, what's been called a controlled process in the cognitive literature. At the same time, the thing you probably noticed while you were doing this exercise is that there was a part of your mind that was looking for the white bear. That part of the mind I've been calling an ironic monitoring process. It searches for mental contents that signal the failure of mental control. In the case of this particular exercise, the failure of mental control is having the white bear come back to mind. So that's the ironic target. You're looking for it. That process is automatic, unconscious, and uninterruptible. It churns along in the background, popping that thing back to mind repeatedly. It's not something you can turn off once you have chosen to follow this intention of putting this thought out of mind. There's always a part of your mind that's looking for it. So when the white bear does come back, it sort of pops. It pops into mind, and you suddenly notice, oh my God, there it is again. You get kind of, sometimes you even get a little physiological reaction. There's a little shiver that comes like, oh, there it is again. Those two processes working together can serve mental control, because one of them is doing the work, the conscious operating process. The other one's checking to make sure the work is done. Normally, we think of that kind of thing as a controlled process system that's very useful in operating any kind of activity. You find them used, described constantly in engineering. In cognitive psychology, there are people who talk about these kinds of processes. What people don't notice is that the ironic monitoring process doesn't just passively monitor. It actively monitors. That is, it increases the likelihood that the unwanted thought will be brought back to mind. Now, how would you test that idea? Well, we tested it using the Stroop color word paradigm. As far as I understand, every psychologist in the world has at one time or another done a Stroop color word test. Is that right? Is everybody here? If you haven't, get with the program, right? The rest of us are doing Stroop studies now. It's your turn. So what we did was ask people to look at a series of words. They appear where that little fixation point, the plus is. And people are asked to tell us the color of the word. In this case, they press a red button or a blue button to tell what color the word is when it comes on the screen. As you see it come on the screen, if you could just say the color of the word. Okay. Now, when I ask you to do this, it's pretty easy to name the color. Let's try it again. Another fixation point. Okay, a little slower on that. Okay. Okay. See why the Stroop might be useful? Okay. Sex comes to mind a little bit faster than does almost anything else, and so it pops into mind ahead of the color. It interferes with color naming and keeps you from naming the color. So this is a good way to tell if something is highly accessible to mind, if it tends to pop to mind early. So we did this a Stroop task. We asked people to name colors of a whole series of words that appear on the screen. They suppress or think about some target word. So try not to think about something or try to think about it. Sometimes they're doing these color namings under low mental load. That is, they're asked to remember a one-digit number while they're doing the color naming. In other conditions, they're doing it under high mental load. They're holding a 5-digit number in mind. Our idea is that with the 5-digit number, you're going to wipe out that controlled process, the operating process. So what's going to happen is the ironic process, the one that's doing the monitoring, is going to pop up and increase the accessibility of the thing you're being asked to think about. So we have high load trials, low load trials. Either you're suppressing or thinking about a target word. And here's what happens. First of all, on the left side, low load, nothing much interesting is going on. When your mind isn't taxed, there's not a whole lot of stuff happening with suppression or thinking, targets and non-targets. The right side is what's interesting. Let's look, first of all, under suppression. Okay. You're trying not to think about a target word. And what happens is it slows you down in naming the color of that word. The thing you're trying not to think about, you have trouble naming the color. That suggests that the word you're trying not to think about is in fact more accessible to consciousness. It's going to pop to mind faster than something else. Okay? And it does this primarily under conditions of high mental load, which I think fits very nicely with that ironic process theory. It's interesting to note on the other side here, what happens when you think about something? When you're trying to think about something, the blue bars, the non-target words, are the words that are now accessible, the things that come most easily to mind. Now, the only time I really remember this happening to me is when I'm doing last-minute studying for an exam. I'm sitting there really working. I need to concentrate on something, and I'm desperately trying to focus my attention on it, and I end up thinking about the noises in the room and the conversations going on and what else is happening all around me. There's something about emergency concentration under mental load that ends up producing the exact opposite of the suppression effect. We end up not being able to attend to the things we want to attend to. This is a very elaborate experiment. Let's come back to some more real-world kinds of examples that I think help make the point. Let's talk first about things you don't want to do Edgar Allan Poe makes this nice point. He says, we stand upon the brink of a precipice, we peer into the abyss, we grow sick and dizzy, and because our reason violently deters us from the brink, therefore do we the most impetuously approach it. Have you ever done this? You stand near the edge of something where it probably wouldn't be a good idea to pitch yourself over the edge, and that's exactly when you tend to teeter. Okay. Well, we thought, let's try this. Well, we didn't want people throwing themselves off the roof, so we decided to try it in a different kind of experiment. We decided to use something called the Chevreul pendulum effect. Now, some of you may know that when you hold a weight on a string, a pendulum, and watch it, simply keep an eye on it as you're holding it, it tends to move where you think it might move. So if somebody says it might move back and forth, you will tend to look for that and produce the effect. We thought this is a good way to check for ironic effects of movement. Could it be that people will end up doing the exact opposite from what they should be doing under conditions of mental load? Well, in order to test that, we have people hold a pendulum over a video camera that's pointed up. And there's a crosshair, and they're asked to hold the pendulum very still. And then we take movies and do 30 seconds of where the pendulum is moving as they're holding it. This person is told, don't move it, and as you can tell, well, of course, nobody can hold perfectly still. They wiggle a little bit. Okay? Here's what happens when you say, don't move it, and count backward from 1,000 by sevens. Okay? When you add mental load, people end up becoming more random in their movements. They seem to be less able to control what they're doing, as you might expect from this maybe ironic process account. But here's where it gets interesting. If you ask people, don't move it in this direction, here's a typical tracing. Okay? The person moves it in exactly the way they're not supposed to. And if you do that while they are counting backward from 1,000 by threes, you get even more movement. People sometimes will get it swinging really nicely. It's never gone over the top completely. This is a really pretty remarkable effect. You can do this to yourself. It's kind of uncanny. I don't recommend it. You can put your eye out. I think this is a good example of what happens in lots of sports errors. Putters, people playing golf describe this exact effect all the time, but people in many sports say there's, particularly when you have an activity where there's something you could do that would be really the dumb move, the one you don't want to do, then given lots of time to think about it and lots of stress, that's exactly what you end up doing. I think this is the beginning of a lot of movement errors that we see, and I think it happens in everyday life as well. There are also ironic errors in perception. This is an experiment I didn't do, but I love it. People are asked to look at these bistable illusions. The duck-rabbit up at the top, you can see it as a duck or you can see it as a rabbit. The one below, you can see as a cat or a swan. Most people can, after a little while, can flip it back and forth in their mind's eye. If you ask people, try not to see one of these figures, and then they're holding down a key to report which one they're seeing, like if they're seeing that particular target. If I tell you, try not to see the duck, you're going to hold down the key for a little bit longer saying, oh, I'm seeing the duck. And an ironic effect here that's occurring in the mind's eye. Ooh. We asked people to write for a couple of minutes and think about a topic. And the topic was either sex or dancing, which many people think of as an equivalent to sex. And we asked them either to think about or try not to think about this for 2 minutes. And we measured their skin conductance level while they were doing this. So how much are their fingers sweating while this is going on? And what you find is that both trying not to think about it and thinking about it make you sweat. Suppression and directed thought, thinking about a topic like sex, I imagine there are a few people who get aroused by dancing thoughts, but probably fairly rare. The thought that's more interesting, the sex thought, is the one that, even when you're trying not to think of it, it creates physiological arousal. Now, I didn't do the right experiment here, because if we're talking about sex, we should have not just been doing skin conductance level. But it turns out, oh, let me come back to this. Let's talk about anxiety for a second. A lot of times we try to relax, and I think we talk about relaxation training of various kinds, progressive relaxation in which we get people to relax. But an interesting effect was observed called relaxation-induced panic. Adler, Krask, and Barlow found this interesting effect where in panic-prone participants, they experienced panic attacks during relaxation therapy. And I actually had this happen in a big class once. I asked a bunch of students in a psychology class to try relaxation in the class, and I actually had somebody pop into a panic attack in the back of the room and have to leave. This is a fairly common effect. I think this might follow the same kinds of rules. It could be an ironic process. So we did a little experiment in which we asked people to take a test in the laboratory. We hooked them up to a skin conductance machine, measured how much they were sweating. We asked some people to relax while they were doing this. So we gave them relaxation instructions, not quite as elaborate as relaxation therapy kinds of instructions, but pretty lengthy, relax your body, all the muscles and things like that. Actually, we're here for the best experiment. This is not the study I did, but I would love to have done this study. It's a study of what I think of as ironic effects in sexual arousal. It's a study done on men. 3 instruction groups. One group is asked to simply relax and watch erotic films. Good line of work if you can get it. Okay? Second group is asked to inhibit any erection while they're watching these films, and they're paid for the lack of erection. Okay? Even a better line of work, actually. A third group, the fantasy group, doesn't get films, but is paid for an erection. Now, the study wasn't done so as to manipulate mental load in the way I might have by asking people to do some kind of parallel task, like remembering a number or something like that. But instead, they used a load in the form of alcohol. So people got loaded. And what you find is that with 2 drinks, the ability of many subjects to inhibit their sexual responses voluntarily was impaired. Then there's kind of a dose-response effect where 3 drinks of alcohol typically impaired the ability of subjects to voluntarily produce fantasy arousal. Okay? So be careful about what you're drinking and how much and when. Now, ironic effects in attraction. I had a good friend in my early career who went on a job interview. And during the job interview, he was attracted to someone who was in the department that he was interviewing with. And during the job interview dinner, they sat and touched ankles under the table. And something got started, and later on, he got the job. And then after that, they got married and had 2 kids, and their lives continued. A lot of this had to do, I think, with the secrecy of playing footsie under the table with somebody on a job interview. What a great time for thought suppression. Okay? You're doing something that's totally illegitimate. You should not be doing it, and yet at the same time, it's cool and you're thinking about it, but people can't know. So you have to try not to think about it because you certainly don't want to display it. You don't want to let people know that this is going on. Well, we decided to try to duplicate this in the laboratory. So we had people come in and sit at a table. There are 4 people, 2 males and 2 females, sit at the table and they play a card game. And we ask them, as they're playing the card game, to follow some instructions that we hand out on pieces of paper to the people at the table. And what they're doing is they're being asked to try to influence the game by touching feet with the person sitting next to them. We set up that it's unknown in some couples that this is going on, whereas in other couples, everybody at the table knows that footsie is going on with this particular pair. And we ask people afterwards how much they're attracted to the person whose feet they were touching during the game. What you find is that the people who are playing secret footsie are attracted to their partner, whereas this doesn't happen in the non-footsie or the non-secret group. I think this bodes the beginning of an entire realm of psychology. The footsie studies, departments of footsie science, I can see it. It's coming soon. Well, in fact, I don't know if you know this, but we've also done a whole series of survey studies in which we ask people about the beginnings of their relationships. And if people report being obsessed with a relationship, that is, they continue to think about it later in life, much past the original relationship, even after they've split up with the person, they don't see them anymore. If you have an obsession like that, it's very likely you'll also report that it was secret while it was going on. So very often, I think, people end up developing obsessions over time because of secrecy, and this is a great example of that. Well, another case. Thought suppression doing interesting things. Viktor Frankl, in The Doctor and the Soul, said sleep is like a dove which is landed near one's hand and stays there as long as one does not pay attention to it. If one attempts to grab it, it quickly flies away. You've probably noticed this yourself, this paradoxical effect of sleep. When you have to sleep, that's when you can't. We decided to try to test this in the laboratory. What we did was we asked people to put on a pair of headphones in their own home, and as they go to sleep, listen to a little tape that we prepared. And the tape, in one case, my voice, well, in both cases, the tape comes on, my voice comes on, and it says, "Good evening. It's time for you to go to sleep." And on one of the tapes, we say, "And we'd like for you to do this in record time." Very important that you try to sleep as quickly as possible. Another group of people gets, you could sleep if you like, you don't have to if you don't want to, whatever. So we have a urgent sleeping and a non-urgent sleeping group. And then we also play music on these tapes. One group of people hears new age music, little quiet babbling brooks and things like that. The other group gets John Philip Sousa marches. Those are the folks who are under high mental load, where we would expect ironic effects. And what you find is the people who are trying to sleep with the Sousa marches, that right golden bar, they're the ones who takes the longest for them to fall asleep. I think this fits my experience exactly. Just precisely when I have emergency sleeping is when I end up staying up all night. I did that last night, just for those of you who are curious about this. Knowing about these effects does not make you immune to them. Now, let's talk about dreams. Why do we dream about falling? Why do we dream about being chased? Why do we dream about strange and embarrassing events? Why do students dream about waking up late for school? Why do students dream about forgetting everything at the exam? Why do professors dream about going totally blank during a lecture? Why do professors dream about losing the toilet paper while we have a box on our head? Okay, that might just be me. Well, I think all of these fit with a liberal interpretation of something Freud talked about, He described how wishes suppressed during the day assert themselves in dreams. Well, I think it's thoughts suppressed during the day that reassert themselves in dreams. So we decided this was an easy thing to test, and we sent a group of people out to do dream reports. They went home, they suppressed a thought before bedtime, or they thought about it, or thought about a person, or they thought about that thought. And then we had them report their dreams. So we then coded how many times they were mentioning the person that they were that had talked about. What you find is that people that there were three conditions. You either mention a person, you think about them and describe before bed this person, an expression group, or you try not to think about them and describe your stream of consciousness into a tape recorder before bed in a suppression group. And what you find is the suppression group reports many more thoughts of the target. This is interesting to me. It suggests to me that we can actually make ourselves dream things by trying not to think about them the night before. It might be useful from a diagnostic standpoint that these are things people are trying not to think about. If somebody reports dreams about a particular topic, it may be something that they've been actively suppressing. It could be a conflict area for them, something that they've been trying to keep out of mind, and it might be a useful thing for understanding their waking life. Well, let's move on to talk about the role of thought suppression in psychopathology. There tends to be quite a bit of this research. I'll just give you the high points. First of all, there have been a lot of studies of instructed thought suppression. That is, just try not to think about this, and then we'll look at the effects of this in various ways. So what you find is that instructed thought suppression increases thoughts of smoking while people are quitting. So if you tell people to try not to think about smoking as a strategy for helping them quit, you get the opposite. Instructed thought suppression increases fear of dentists. So I send you to the dentist and I say, while you're there, try not to think about it. You end up being more afraid of dentists afterwards. It reduces the immune response. Pennebaker's been doing studies now for several years that suggest that this effect is a real one. Thought suppression increases distress in rape survivors who are suffering from PTSD. So people who are actually asked to try not to think about something end up having more PTSD symptoms. Increases thoughts about pain and decreases pain tolerance. So these are all experimental manipulations, so we're not even talking about something that's complicated by individual differences. This is just straight experimental science, and you get all these effects of thought suppression that are exactly the opposite of what you would want. Then there are also dispositional studies of thought suppression. We came up with a little scale that we call the White Bear Suppression Inventory. It has items on it like, there are things I try not to think about. Just a series of simple statements like that. And what you find is that scale is correlated at a significant level with measures of depression, anxiety, OCD, with poor coping in accident victims, with dissociative memory experiences following trauma, with intentional self-injury in adolescence, with intrusive suicidal thoughts. So just the proneness to suppress thoughts seems to be associated with all kinds of problems. I can't say that it's necessarily causal because it makes sense that somebody who's having some kind of difficulty will also, as a response, try not to think about it. So it's not necessarily the case that the suppression causes the psychopathology. It could be the other way around. Or it could be a cyclical relationship in which each causes the other in turn. But I think there's a general relationship here that's worth noting. Well, all this suggests that a science of thought suppression basically says it's not a great idea to suppress thoughts. You are likely to get something in the range of problems with attention, perception, motion, arousal, anxiety, sexual arousal, attraction, insomnia, dreams, psychopathology. We shouldn't suppress. So what should we do? This was always the second question I got. I've been talking about the thought suppression for work for years, and my talks usually stop just about here, and everybody would walk out of the room saying, what was that? That guy just told us that we've got a big problem, but he didn't tell us how to solve it. Well, I don't know how to solve it yet. But I have a few ideas, and I'm sure you have lots of ideas, which is why I'm talking to you. I want you to think about this in terms of how it relates to the kinds of therapeutic difficulties that you see in your practice, the kinds of things that you have to deal with, and think about the role of thought suppression, how you get around this big block in the human mind, these ironic processes. Well, it suggests that we could come up with an art of thought suppression. So now that we know the science, how do you do it if you really need to do it? Well, the theory basically says that whenever you directly try to suppress a thought and add mental load, you tend to get ironic effects. You get the very thought that you were trying to suppress. So, let's get rid of mental load. That should get rid of some ironic effects. Consider how you can do that. One possibility, you withdraw people from load directly. So all that multitasking you do in your life, those many other things you're doing at the same time while you're trying to control your mind, if you just skip all that, you might be able to engage in mental control better. Those of you who are texting in the back row, pay attention. Another way to cut out mental load, simple relaxation. This is the kind of advice that it might be hard for a group like this to take into account, because here you are on what could otherwise be a vacation day, sitting here doing work. You're listening to me, you're doing jobs, you're heavily involved. Go ahead and relax, okay? It's okay, fine with me. Another way to kill mental load, revise your timelines or priorities. Not everything needs to be done yesterday. I think a lot of us get into this idea that our world has to be perfect now and we have to do it in a big hurry. And just giving ourselves some space and time is oftentimes a good fix for this problem. We can also ask for help. Okay? Get a dog. Okay? And what I mean by this is get your best friend. Get somebody to ask for assistance. A lot of times mental control is more easily done with somebody else around to help you. My wife is a particularly expert in helping me control a lot of my unwanted thoughts and activities. She's really good at helping me distract myself, at finding ways of doing things, being my friend when I need it. We can all use a person like that. I think reaching out to other people and asking them for help when we need reduction in our own mental load is a perfectly smart activity. Well, another way you get rid of ironic effects is the other side of the equation. Instead of getting rid of mental load, if we assume people always are going to have some kind of mental load or stress, maybe what we can do is try to get rid of direct suppression. So let's do indirect suppression. Instead of trying to get rid of unwanted mental states directly by effectively saying, I want to stop feeling sad, I want to stop being anxious, I want to stop whatever it is that we're having, let's sneak up on ourselves. Let's do something different. I think a lot of the therapeutic techniques I've heard about at this conference have to do with this approach of finding indirect means of engaging in something that eventually becomes an effective mental control technique, but isn't started with that in mind. Well, what's a trick? For example, finding an absorbing distractor. I mentioned to you that when people try not to think about a white bear, they look for anything in the room and they find various things and they're not effective distractors. You probably did this. Like, you try not to think about a white bear, so you think about one thing, it doesn't work, so you quickly move to something else. And that doesn't work, so you drop that and you move to something else. That movement through all kinds of different distractors ends up becoming simply useless. We found in an experiment that if we simply asked people after trying not to think about a white bear, we gave them the white bear instruction, then we said, and if you happen to think of about a white bear, think of a red Volkswagen instead. We gave them one distractor. And what happens is that rebound effect goes away. Having one thing to think about, even a stupid thing like a red Volkswagen, seems to be enough to take the pressure off, instead of it becoming a suppression that we're doing, it becomes attention that we're doing. We're attending to the distractor. Hypnosis. Don't anybody look at this. Hypnosis is another technique for engaging in useful sorts of suppression. In fact, I've seen a wonderful study on this by Bryant recently, in which they took people who were high and low in hypnotic susceptibility. They gave them a very difficult suppression task and asked them to do sentence completions relevant to a thought they were suppressing. And what you find is people who are low in hypnotic susceptibility find that they can suppress, but people who are high in hypnotic susceptibility, they don't show you suppression effects. The thought doesn't come back. Hypnosis, of course, is something with very broad individual differences. A very small portion of the population is very good at mental control, so I don't think you can count on this with a lot of people. But there is a subgroup out there of folks who are good at suppression because they're high in hypnotic susceptibility. Mindfulness and meditation as an indirect suppression technique. The last year or so, I've been in a yoga class. My wife and I got into this. We thought it was kind of an interesting thing to do. We took it up mostly at first just as a kind of a lark. I'm now developing a real joy in this activity. And a lot of it comes from its usefulness as a mental control technique. That over time, I find that the yoga that I've been doing is basically paying attention to your breathing. So while you're doing the various yoga poses, you're also focusing on your breathing. What a great distracting stimulus. Okay, your breathing indicates that you're alive. You're obviously well. You're breathing. These are all good things. And it's a constant moving stimulus. It's changing all the time. It's not holding still. It's really hard to pay attention to something that holds still, but it's very easy to pay attention to something that is moving. Your breath is moving. I think it's really an ideal stimulus. I'm starting out a series of studies on this. I hope to report back next time I see you all on the effects of thinking about your breathing on thought suppression. I suspect that might be an ideal distractor. Talking about it. Some of you may be aware of Jamie Pennebaker's work on the effects of opening up, self-disclosure, something about telling somebody about it that really helps get problems and thoughts off your mind. I think this is really the social psychology of mental control. And Pennebaker started this in the 80s. There's now a lot of research suggesting interesting effects here. They're not all consistent, but the effects are broad enough. And in people who are high disclosers, who tend to tell other people a lot of stuff, you're particularly likely to get very good effects in mental control of just getting something off your chest, telling other people about it. Okay. Finally, what I think used to be called a paradoxical approach, which we now understand as being a matter of acceptance. What a great way to engage in mental control by basically accepting the problem. Instead of fighting all of these things we've been talking about and creating ironic effects, if you simply say, okay, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Admittedly, acceptance can have its own problems. In the case of someone accepting suicide thoughts, I'm not sure that you want to go there, at least in a simple way. But acceptance in a more general sense, I think, can have this paradoxically useful effect of reducing the person's likelihood of having the very thoughts that they're normally motivated to avoid. Well, to sum all this up, pretty long quote from Bertrand Russell, but it's beautiful, so let me tell you. Now, every kind of fear grows worse by not being looked at. The proper course is to think about it with great concentration until it has become completely familiar. In the end, familiarity will blunt its terrors, the whole subject will become boring, and our thoughts will turn away from it, not as formerly by an effort of will, but through mere lack of interest in the topic. when you find yourself inclined to brood on anything, the best plan is always to think about it even more than you naturally would, until at last its morbid fascination is worn off. Thank Bertrand Russell, and thank you all. If you take a couple of questions. Yes?
What do you think about the CBT technique of thought stopping?
What do I think about the CBT technique of thought stopping? I think that all this research applies, and I suspect that it might be counterproductive. I've seen quite a bit of stuff on it. There's one pretty good review article that was published in the 90s on thought stopping, and everything I've seen suggests that the technique tends to follow the same rules we would predict from this thought suppression research, including things like the rubber band snapping approach and yelling stop or anything like that. If anything, the one time it might work is if you make your thought stopping technique public, then doing some kind of a public commitment to it. It's a little bit like quitting smoking and telling everybody you're quitting smoking. It might be a little more effective because you might get kind of a public commitment to that. But I can't imagine that it's going to be particularly effective given what we know from these techniques. Yes? Yes?
In dialectical behavior therapy, there is a technique that's called push-away thoughts. So the idea is to put the thoughts in a box for a while if you can't solve them, and then attend to something else.
Right. So the question is, the technique of saying push away to thoughts, putting them in a box for a while until you can deal with them, is that useful at all? I think that actually could be useful. The reason being that I think we're really good at postponing thoughts. So I can postpone all sorts of unwanted thoughts I have by kind of designating a time when it's going to be okay to think that. And in fact, I do that all the time. I'm going on a vacation and I know there's certain things I have to think about, and I could be plagued with thoughts of all the stuff I have to do before the vacation, but I just put it off until, okay, now is when I'm going to start thinking about these things. I think we can kind of set an internal alarm clock that says it's okay to think about these thoughts at this time, or in good time when I get around to it. The danger is that if this becomes permanent, it then has all the same effects here as straight suppression. Maybe one more question. Yes, back here.
You describe your yoga and then focusing on your breathing as a separate category from an interesting distractor. Why did you not think that behaving that way wasn't just another kind of interesting distractor?
You might be right. I'm not willing to argue about this because I'm still trying to figure out what yoga is doing. As a recent adherent myself, I'm just learning about this. I think there are other things that are going on that have to do with learning effects over time, effects having to do with getting control over the mind and the body in one area that make you generalize to other areas. There's several different effects that are going on with yoga, so I don't think that we can make kind of a simple pronouncement about how it behaves as only a distraction technique. I think there's something else going on, or there may be something else going on. The research is not there. We really don't know yet. Okay? So I'd be happy to take on other questions afterwards, one by one, but I think everybody here might be feeling like we've had enough fun. Let's quit for today. Thank you again.